Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the North Carolina Chamber, welcome to the What the Infrastructure Bill Means for North Carolina webinar. I'm Mark Hoggins with the North Carolina Chamber. All attendees are muted to avoid any distractions during today's presentations. If you would like to submit questions during the meeting, please use the question and answer box and do not use the chat box. In fact, it's likely that we'll try to compile all your questions and maybe try and send out some resources later, as we just may not be able to get to some of them today. The recording of today's webinar will be made available to you via email within 24 hours of the webinar. First, there's been a lot of talk throughout the past summer and into the fall surrounding the politics of the infrastructure bill. Coupled with the prospects of the President's Build Back Better plan, what we hope to provide for you today is a look under the hood of what's actually in the $1.2 trillion Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or better known as the Infrastructure Bill or the IIJA, and what it means for North Carolina. We're going to hear from a wide range of folks today, ranging from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the legislative staff, and to our very own Department of Transportation. Second, and I promise we'll get on with the excellent slate of speakers right after this, I can't let us get too far into the program without mentioning the North Carolina Chamber's Destination 2030 Coalition. With other states exploring new ways to revamp their transportation funding strategies, the Destination 2030 Coalition is focused on identifying the bold solutions that will enable in North Carolina to modernize our transportation revenue portfolio. We believe that the business community must have a seat at the table when looking at a long-term revenue formula, one that cannot be overly reliant on the motor fuels tax. That's exactly why this coalition exists, and why we, the North Carolina Chamber, are willing to do the hard work of coming up with solutions and advocating for policy alternatives. We're pleased with the passage of this bill and the much needed funding for our transportation network, and of course, the more broad than just transportation funding, which will help bridge the gap, we believe, between our short-term revenue issues and finding long-term sustainable and resilient solutions. Now, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Ed Mortimer. Ed serves as Vice President of Transportation and Infrastructure at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Ed oversees the development and implementation of the Chamber's transportation infrastructure policy and represents the Chamber on Capitol Hill, as well as before the administration and industry organizations. He also leads the Americans for Transportation Mobility Coalition, a collaborative effort by business, labor, transportation stakeholders, and concerned citizens to advocate for improved and increased federal investment in the nation's aging and overburdened transportation system. Thank you, Ed. Take it away.
Mark, thank you very much. Good to be with everybody today. And I'm really glad to join you with good news. Obviously, it's been a rough couple of years, but this is a good news story about a once in a generational opportunity to not just fix old infrastructure, but to modernize it. I want to start by really thanking the North Carolina Chamber. I know there's several coalitions on this call from North Carolina that have been advocating with us for many years to modernize our infrastructure. And again, it's a shared responsibility. It's not all in the federal government, but if we're going to have this national infrastructure that is going to allow us to compete against China and other countries, that's going to allow us to improve our mobility, improve our quality of life for our citizens, we needed this federal bill, and we needed to get it done on a bipartisan basis. And I know you're going to hear from speakers today, a Republican and a Democrat, and I really want to highlight from our perspective the importance of, in a closely divided government, we view infrastructure as the circulatory system of our economy. It's a core responsibility of government at all levels to make sure that we have a safe, efficient, and modern infrastructure. And we're very proud to have worked with Congressman Price, Senator Burr, and many others in the delegation to get this bill over the goal line. We've been working on this legislation for over 10 years with Republicans and Democrats, and we're finally glad to say we got it over the goal line. This is going to be a transformational bill for our country, over $550 billion in new investment in infrastructure over the next 5 years. Almost 50% increase in North Carolina's highway funding. You're going to get $7.9 billion over 5 years. That's an incredible amount of investment that, matched with state resources, we really believe can transform the infrastructure of North Carolina And again, this bill is also going to make sure that we have infrastructure that will allow North Carolinians to travel goods and people safely throughout the whole nation. Again, I mentioned we're falling behind China. The World Economic Forum ranks America's infrastructure 13th. We keep dropping every year. And this legislation shows that government can address a critical issue of the business community and the American people. So we are glad to have been a part of this. You all played a great role in advocating with your members of Congress to get this done. But the job's not done, folks. Now we got to make sure that these investments deliver for North Carolina and for the country. We need to make sure that the projects that are invested in are game changers. You might remember we had a stimulus bill in 2009 that was called the Recovery Act, and they used the term shovel ready. Well, shovel ready ended up meaning filling potholes and curbs. And again, not minimizing those, but this bill is much different. This bill is going to be shovel worthy. These are projects that are going to be game changers for your communities. They're going to substantially improve the infrastructure of your region. And again, it's incumbent upon all of us to make sure that our elected leaders know the projects that are going to be those game changers, that are going to alleviate congestion, that are going to fix some of our water systems that have lead pipes. And again, I think this bill is very unique at the federal level. Traditionally in Congress, they do like a surface transportation bill, they do a water bill, an airport bill. This infrastructure bill is comprehensive. And what do I mean by that? It's physical infrastructure. So our transportation networks, our water system, both wastewater and stormwater, our rural broadband, to make sure that there are public-private partnership solutions so that every American has broadband access. And again, I think we've all seen through the pandemic, if you're going to have a job, if you're going to be active in the 21st century, every citizen needs that broadband access. And we're excited. The private sector is willing to step up and work with our public partners to finish that delivery of broadband for everyone. And then energy. We need to have a diversity of energy sources so that this nation's independent. This bill is continuing to encourage other sources of energy, electric vehicles, hydrogen, as we continue to, diversify our energy sources and make sure that we are being good stewards of our environment. And I think the American business community is excited about that opportunity to be a partner in that role. Now, this bill is a compromise. It's not the perfect bill. And it took Republicans and Democrats coming together, which means that there was a give and take. But from our perspective, this is what government is at its best. In spite of what we read in the news and what we hear, we see all the vitriol and the partisanship going on. This is actually an example of when government is at its best, when it can work to address a critical issue of the American people. And we're proud of the members of Congress who voted for this bill. Now, there are those out there that are trying to criticize some of these members of Congress for voting yes for the bipartisan infrastructure bill. We urge you, and we at the U.S. Chamber are standing up for these members. This bill is physical infrastructure. There's been some confusion that the administration and Democrats in Congress are pushing something called Build Back Better. That's a very different bill than this bipartisan infrastructure bill. We worked very hard to separate the two. But again, this bill is a physical infrastructure bill. The Build Back Better bill is a social spending bill. And I think from the U.S. Chamber's perspective, there are a lot of issues in there that we would like to have addressed: childcare, affordable housing, some of the climate issues. But unfortunately, it's being done on a partisan basis. It's being done by raising taxes on corporations to pay for it. And our view is, let's get back to what we did on the infrastructure bill. Let's come up with some bipartisan solutions. In a closely divided Congress, bipartisan solutions are the ones that are going to be durable and last the longest. So we are very opposed to Build Back Better, but we were strongly supportive with the bipartisan infrastructure bill. So I wanted to kind of talk through that and make sure folks understand the difference. The bipartisan infrastructure bill is not the new Green Deal. This is about modernizing our infrastructure. This is about building infrastructure that is going to handle different climate conditions. And you all in North Carolina have seen some of these natural disasters over the last several years. Let's build the infrastructure to last. One other point, and then I look forward to taking your questions, is that we did not address the money issue Some of the pay-fors in this bill were using unused COVID relief money, some general fund money. But again, you all know this, but just to remind everybody, infrastructure is building assets that the American people benefit from for 50 to 75 years to come. There's a lot of spending that goes on in Washington. There's not much spending that can last and have a benefit to the economy as infrastructure. So that's why we've supported this, but we were disappointed that we did not have a serious discussion about user fees. We look forward to working with the North Carolina Chamber. Mark talked about your Destination 2030 plan. We do need to have some serious discussions about sustainable long-term funding. And I mentioned this is a compromise, so we didn't get that part done, but we are committed to work with you all and others to get back to how do we have sustainable long-term funding as we continue to modernize our infrastructure. So again, it's a great opportunity to be with you all today. I'm glad to be part of this conversation. And Mark, I'll pass it back to you.
Thanks, Ed. And first, thank you for the years, really years of hard work it's taken to get to this point. In that vein, we've seen pushes for infrastructure for years and years. What do you think actually led to this package getting across the finish line?
So, Mark, I think you kind of laid it out. It's years and years of work. It takes a long time to get good policy done. And so a lot of people were involved. I think we broadened our stakeholder community. So business, labor, environmentalists coming together. At the end of the day, we ended up getting 40% of Senate Republicans to vote for this bill in a very difficult environment, including your senators. I think just explaining to them, this is a core responsibility of government. We got this bill through the House. Actually, it came down to the Congressional Black Caucus brokered a deal between some of the more moderate Democrats and the progressive Democrats. So again, there are a lot of champions along the way, but I think the sustained effort, continuing to talk about the need for these infrastructure investments and the timeliness of them as we're getting out of pandemic, I think that all came together finally to get this bill over the goal line. But it was years of work to get there. And, we got to take advantage of this once in a generational opportunity. We're not going to get a bill like this through Congress anytime soon. So we need to make sure that these investments go to projects that are truly going to improve the lives of North Carolinians, that are going to provide you all the opportunity for long-term economic growth. And we look forward to partnering with the government, with you all, to make sure that these dollars go to the projects that truly are going to make a difference in your lives.
Ed, you mentioned long-term economic growth. What do you think this means for U.S. economic competitiveness worldwide?
Well, I mean, I mentioned earlier in my remarks, China's doubling the amount of investment in infrastructure that we are. We're ranked 13th and been dropping. We already see the supply chain issues that we're having. Part of what we're seeing, and I think North Carolina can take advantage of this opportunity, is that we're starting to realize that we need to move distribution centers further inland away from our coast. So I think there's an opportunity as we modernize the infrastructure to think anew and make sure we have roads that connect to these distribution centers more farther inland for rail, making sure that we utilize our ports more efficiently. So I think there's an opportunity here. We're going from, we built this infrastructure when we were in a brick and mortar economy. We're now in an e-commerce environment. So again, this legislation is going to allow the private sector to bring in a lot of innovation and technology to think anew and make sure that we build to be competitive for the long term. We're in a race with China. This is going to turn that race around and put us back in the game. And that's why we continue to push. And we're very proud that there was a bipartisan push to get this thing done.
Yeah, and it seems that it covers a lot of those various areas, right? Not just roads and bridges, but it's also got some investment in ports and rail and aviation and airports and stuff like that. So it's pretty wide ranging. Any surprises in the IIJA from your perspective?
So I think one of the surprises, we were a little disappointed. We were looking for more opportunities to enhance private investment to supplement core federal funding. There was some talk of an infrastructure bank. It didn't end up in the final package. But again, one of the things I didn't mention in my opening remarks is that a very undersaid part of this bill that we think is going to make a big difference for both public investment and encouraging private investment is modernizing the permitting process. Language in this bill will codify what the previous administration had pushed, which is one federal decision, which is a 2-year time limit on major federal projects. So modernizing the permitting process, providing that transparency is going to make a difference. But we were disappointed that we thought there was some opportunity to really encourage even more private investment. But again, something to work on moving forward. And then obviously disappointment in that we didn't have that user fee conversation. But that being said, there is a provision in this bill that urges Congress to look at a vehicle mile travel nationwide. And so the next time we do this bill in 5 years, Congress is going to have the information to see, is there a mechanism other than the fuel tax that can provide that sustainable funding source moving forward?
And I think you probably piqued a lot of interest talking about permit reform, especially by the folks on this call. And that's obviously been a concern. There's a need for the permits, but having clarity and kind of expectations known up front as far as what the timeline is on that and how long it takes is integral and is very important for the business community. You kind of covered it, but what's next? The bill passed just a few weeks ago. There's obviously other conversations, other things happening in Washington, but as far as infrastructure goes, what's next?
So what's next is the administration has named Mitch Landrieu, who's the former mayor of New Orleans, to kind of head up the implementation of this bill. So we're working with his office and the administration, the Department of Transportation, Department of Energy, Department of Commerce, to make sure that as the implementation of this bill, that it is easy for the business community to access these funds, that these funds are going to go to projects that are truly going to be game changers for the community. So we're working with all of those stakeholders. What I would encourage everyone on this call is this is a time for North Carolinians to come together. I think the chamber is the venue to do it. Make priorities. Those projects that are going to get funded are those that there is priorities being made, that you can show that there's stakeholder support and that there's a plan. The days of the federal government just paying for all of your infrastructure are gone. But the days of showing that you have a plan and you need some federal gap funding, those are the types of projects that are going to get funded. So I think it's an opportunity for you all to come together, make sure that you highlight the ones that truly need to get done right away. Because again, this bill lasts 5 years for most of the programs. There's some 8 years of spend out, but we have to take advantage of this opportunity. We cannot let this go to waste.
Well, thank you, Ed. Thank you for your time. I have seen that there's a question in the Q&A. I think that actually may be a better question for AMNA from NCDOT a little bit later, Buzz. So we'll get to that a little bit later in the program. But Ed, thank you for your time. Thank you for everything you've done on this, the relentless work over the last few years, and congratulations.
Great. Thank you all very much.
We're going to pivot now to our next speaker, Nora Blaylock. Nora serves as the legislative director for Representative David Price of North Carolina's 4th Congressional District, handling a portfolio that includes transportation, housing, healthcare, and higher education. She's been with the congressman in his Washington, D.C. office since 2014. She's earned her master's of public policy from George Washington University in 2020 and received her undergraduate degree from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in 2013. Nora, thanks for being with us today.
Of course, thanks so much for inviting me. It's really good to talk to you all today. So thank you. As Mark said, I'm Congressman Price's legislative director. For those of you who don't know him, he represents North Carolina's 4th Congressional District, and he is the chairman of the Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development Appropriations Subcommittee over here on the House side. So basically in charge of funding DOT and HUD. So really excited about all the conversations around infrastructure right now. After years of talking about important infrastructure needs, we are so happy that Congress and the Biden administration has come together to make these investments a reality. For a long time, Infrastructure Week was sort of a platitude or a punchline, but not anymore. BIF, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Framework, is finally been signed into law, and it's been a long time coming, and we're all very excited. It will lead to millions of good-paying jobs, build a foundation for strong economic growth, and help ensure that we can all succeed in the 21st century. So as chair of THUD, we've been making substantial down payments from year to year on the lead up to passing this bill. In fact, if any of y'all have talked to my boss, you've probably heard him say that THUD is actually the infrastructure bill. Others talk a really good game on it, and we actually fund it. We've been making substantial annual investments on really important transportation priorities. Over the last 4 fiscal years, Mr. Price and his ranking member, Mr. Mario Diaz-Balart of Florida, have worked in a bipartisan manner and increased annual transportation spending by nearly $19 billion over authorized levels. But we have to go beyond these annual incremental increases to make a once-in-a-generation transformative investment to really kickstart our nation's infrastructure needs, which is what we do in BIF. It's forward-looking investments across all modes of transportation with really important focuses on equity, safety, and resiliency. It's a historic investment in passenger and freight rail, which we really hope will help North Carolina develop that next critical link in the Charlotte to Raleigh to Richmond to DC Southeast Corridor that we all envision and are really working hard to bring to fruition. It's also the largest ever investment in public transit. It increases federal funding by 30% and is something my boss is really excited about. As our state, in particular, the Triangle region continues to grow, our transit infrastructure must keep up with increasing population growth. We are not going to be able to solve commuting time issues by building more lanes on I-40. We have to invest in buses, commuter rail, and other modes of transit to cut emissions and to improve opportunities for people who have traditionally not had this access to public transit. The bill also includes $25 billion for airports, which is it should cut the FAA modernization and safety backlog in half, which is music to all of our ears in North Carolina. We all know how desperately RDU needs a new runway. It also includes critically important investments in broadband, water and sewer infrastructure, and modernizing our energy grid. And this all means more local jobs, which is great. They're estimating it will add 2 million jobs a year over the next 10 years, which is a very significant number and will help us all continue to recover from the pandemic and move back towards a full labor force. But while this is all really exciting, we can't forget Congress's most basic role, which is funding the government. The THUD bill Mr. Price's work to come up with for FY22 is a new commitment to updating our aging transportation infrastructure in rural, urban, and suburban communities. It will bolster our resiliency to natural disasters in a changing climate, which is particularly important in hurricane-prone North Carolina, and it should remedy existing inequities in our transportation systems. The bill includes $84.1 billion in discretionary spending, which is an increase of $8.7 billion above last year. It also has some really carefully selected targeted investments through renewed community project funding. For some of y'all who have been around for a while, they're formerly known as earmarks, and those will directly benefit local projects across the country. In North Carolina's 4th District, this includes funding for economic development projects to improve the train station in Lewisburg, to revitalize downtown Zebulon, and include some affordable housing projects elsewhere in the Triangle. So the federal government is currently operating under continuing resolution, a short-term spending patch through February 18th. And it is really time for the House and Senate to come together to negotiate a bipartisan bicameral bill to fund DOT, HUD, and the rest of the government through the remainder of the fiscal year. And then finally, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the importance of pairing all of this fiscal year 22 BIF with the Build Back Better Act. It is critically important. Infrastructure is so much more than roads and bridges. We have got to invest in our society's human infrastructure as well, building more affordable housing, providing workforce development opportunities for our workforce, and lowering just those everyday cost burdens on working families, particularly in healthcare and childcare. Not to mention, the Build Back Better Act is fully paid for, which I think is something that just doesn't get discussed enough. So together, BIF and the Build Back Better Act will help North Carolina grow, help us continue to attract top-tier employers, invest in our people, and stay globally competitive for the future. So I really appreciate y'all inviting me to speak with you today, and more than happy to continue to work with y'all. And please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions moving forward. So thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Nora, for being on this morning and for those comments. And I know you've got a tight timeline, so thank you for taking some time to visit with us this morning. We're going to pivot next to John McDonald. John graduated from Appalachian State University with a bachelor's degree in international and comparative politics back in 2006, moved to DC, where he received a master's in legislative affairs from George Washington University. He's currently a senior legislative assistant for Senator Richard Burr, handling transportation, energy, budget, and telecommunications. He's previously served as a professional staff member on the Senate Committee on Veterans Affairs. John, thank you for being with us today. Would love to hear your comments on the IIJA, and if you can stick around just for a couple questions, come back on in a minute. So thanks for being with us.
Yeah, thanks, Mark, and everybody on the call. And I guess I'd be remiss to say I work with Nora and Senator Representative Price's office, and it's going to be a loss to the delegation. The work we're able to do across the aisle, and Representative Price is well positioned specifically on transportation issues. So with his retirement, Representative Butterfield's and Senator Burr's, we're going to have a new looking delegation, but I think we've done a lot of good with all three of them being here on the Hill. So anyway, thanks for having me today. Senator Burr really believes this is an important investment. And I think the perspective Nora just shared, as a Republican in the Senate, we don't agree on a lot often, but this bill right here demonstrates there is still bipartisanship in the Senate and Congress. This is the largest core infrastructure investment in our nation's history. And for a state like North Carolina that continues to grow, we have to have that investment because as more families and businesses call North Carolina home, we have to have the right infrastructure in place to meet the needs of that growing population. I know many of the members on this call of the North Carolina Chamber generally have met with myself or other members and staff of the delegation over the last 5 years discussing the need for infrastructure program. And thankfully today we can say that was a success. So in my time today, I wanted to take a few minutes to walk through why Senator Burr, other GOP negotiators, including Senator Tillis, joined this effort, how we got the bill across the finish line, and in our view, what were the big wins for the state. As Nora kind of alluded to, the idea of an infrastructure week became a bit of a laugh line on Capitol Hill. Members of both parties, I think it was clear, had interest in additional spending on core infrastructure like highways, water, broadband. But given the Trump show that we had over the last 4 years, the ingredients are there, but the cooks, President Trump, Speaker Pelosi, were unwilling to get real negotiations underway. The pandemic changed any number of things, but it definitely changed the political calculation with the economic toll the virus took on the U.S. economy. So by mid-spring, earlier this year, after passage of the American Recovery Plan, it was clear congressional Democrats, and we are in the minority, but it was clear the spending was not over. And moreover, what constituted infrastructure was changing. So with the sizable majority in the Senate that believed core infrastructure was an important use of taxpayer funds, and it also had the benefit of being popular, the core things, water, broadband, highways, bridges. We knew there was an opportunity there. And I think, at least from our perspective, if good faith negotiation yielded a good bill, that's great. If it forestalled terrible spending down the road, that would be even better. So, as kind of things progressed, the Environment and Public Works Committee over here in the Senate had put together a bipartisan bill, but we did not have the ability yet to tag on increased funding to include a lot of other programs. So I think a lot of the credit should go to Senator Sinema and Portman for keeping this group of senators negotiating through the summer from May, say, to August. As I said, the Gusty agreement, and probably the most important part, was the highway bill that was reported out by the Environment and Public Works Committee. That was done unanimously. And if you can get Shelley Moore Capito and Senator Sanders agreeing on something, that is a good basis to start negotiations. So the framework this framework of the underlying highway bill served two purposes. Or had two important functions. It created a situation where we knew the authorizations for the FAST Act were ending. So that created a natural catalyst for Congress to begin to act. And with a bipartisan base that we were starting out with, that was done in a regular order, we could point to something that was not totally foreign to the way Congress operates. So Senator Burr joined these negotiations, and we had two main goals. Ensure North Carolina received the allotments and formula payments in line with our state's growth to the extent possible. We heard discussion earlier on the need for more user fees, different modernized funding stream. So that was definitely a goal. And the second was we need to pay for this bill to the extent possible. Things progressed from Memorial Day, say through June and July, stops and starts. There were working groups. I have to say that the White House became intimately involved in July, and it certainly complicated things. All of a sudden, Senate Republicans, Senate Democrats were negotiating not only with their Senate colleagues, but with the White House, who clearly wanted a deal, but also had motivations outside of the bipartisan framework, where the senators, at least the members of the group, had been singularly focused up to that point. What Ed mentioned earlier, some of the innovative financing options, they eventually fell out of the bill, not because I think that senators certainly wanted them to be included. The issue became some of the White House's, what we viewed as political assistances for funding streams or carve out for green energy check, et cetera. And just because of that, in the end, they fell away. And what remained were big plus ups for a number of programs. So one of our frustrations, I mean, and no bill is perfect. One of our frustrations remained is North Carolina for a long time had not been held harmless at receiving 95% return for all our payments into the Highway Trust Fund. Because the formula, frankly, does not take into account the growth we've had over the last couple of decades. Unfortunately for us, both within the BIF negotiations and in the broader Senate, is there's only about 18 states that are net payers. So the coalition gets you to about 36 senators. They're bipartisan, but they don't get you close to the 50 senators needed or the 60 to actually accomplish anything. So what we did during the negotiation, at least our focus was, we pivoted from trying to fix the formula or increasing the amount of use fee to ensuring that all the formulas included in this bill had a really strong rural focus. And for North Carolina, that's important. We have 50% of the state's rural, but we also benefit from the triangle, Charlotte, Wilmington. I mean, large metropolitan areas that are growing, but for our purposes, as we negotiated this bill, that rural focus was very, very important. And because of that, the $65 billion that's in there for broadband, which we largely done by formula, or the new rural surface transportation grants contained in the bill, set aside $2 billion for that. North Carolina is going to be well positioned to take advantage of that. I would yield to North Carolina DOT on, how the funding will specifically affect budgeting through the STIP and other parts of their budget. But I would flag that, $7.7 billion in federal highway formula funding for highway bridges is a huge, huge win for the state. That is 28.5%, give or take, increase over FAST Act levels. There's $1 billion for transit. And kind of moving away from the highways and bridges set, there's $7 billion in this bill for Army Corps related to flood mitigation, including $6 billion for construction. That will begin the process to alleviate some of the pressure on the backlog of authorized construction projects the Corps has. We in North Carolina have authorized projects as well as those in the study phase. So we're working as we begin this implementation process to work with the Corps to ensure that our projects are prioritized, because given our history with Hurricane Matthew, Hurricane Francis, and others, mitigation flood mitigation and resiliency is very, very important. And if we can hold back water, if we can make water flow better, we reduce the amount of spend we have on the backside of these natural disasters. So that was a big win in our view for the state. And I guess lastly, I guess I would throw in that there was a highway designation in, a small, kind of small potatoes, but it was important for US 421, especially given the recent announcement by Toyota. So I'm going to leave it there. There might be other questions. Happy to answer them. Again, I just appreciate everybody's time this morning.
Thanks, John. Just one quick question, and then we're going to pivot over to North Carolina DOT. Any surprises in the IIJA as you all are reviewing it and looking at implementation? Any surprises from Senator Burr?
Not in the final product. I think what surprised us are some of the things that didn't make it in. I think Ed kind of said the same thing. Because right, what ended up being in this bill largely are derived from committee processes for the EPW, the Energy Committee. I mean, those were items that were negotiated earlier than this and then added in. I guess the items, some of the pay fors, whether it was on crypto or the financing schemes that just didn't make it in the end. I think that was the most surprising aspect, but I don't think anything caught us off guard at the end when we got ready to actually vote for this in August. I think we had done a fairly good job of getting rid of all those surprises.
Well, great. Thank you, John. Thank you, and thank Nora for our time today. We really appreciate you both giving us kind of a federal and delegation perspective. We appreciate all the work you, both your bosses do for North Carolina and you know, the continued focus on making sure that this is going to work for our state. I'm going to introduce our next speaker, Amna Cameron. Amna is the North Carolina Department of Transportation's Deputy Director of Strategic Initiatives and Program Support. She served as a lead staff to the NC First Commission, which we're very thankful for the work there, and co-authored the Commission's report. Prior to joining NC DOT in October of 2018, she spent 13 years working in various capacities in the North Carolina General Assembly Fiscal Research Division, including 10 years on the transportation team. So she knows this stuff, is what I'm trying to say. She received a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from the University of Wilmington and has a Master of Public Administration from Western Carolina University. Amna, the floor is all yours, and we look forward to your remarks.
Mark, thank you for the kind introduction. And let me begin by thanking the North Carolina Chamber for the work of the Destination 2030 and its advocacy for revenue modernization. It is my pleasure to discuss IIJA's impact on NC DOT. Next slide. The IIJA is a transformational bill, but this transformation is not going to happen overnight. For over the 5 years timeline, the DOT is in a good position to move quickly to realign our funding and apply for new discretionary funding. The bill includes $350 billion for highway programs with more than a dozen new formula and discretionary programs. As a high-level summary, NC DOT's formula funding will increase by 32% this year. This includes funds for highways, bridges, and public transit. Apart from the funding, this bill includes numerous provisions that reframe the conversation about the purpose of transportation, from equity, climate change, and increased rural focus and greater community involvement. It also includes a wealth of pragmatic provisions that will expedite project delivery, upgrade security, and improve resiliency. Next slide. The transportation community is a myriad of organizations that worked in partnership to secure passage. from our congressional delegation from the U.S. Chamber, ARTBA, AASHTO, NC Go, Destination 2030, and state DOTs. We provided a uniform voice that transportation investments matter economically, but also to improve our quality of life, our health, and our safety. And a functioning transportation system is the bedrock to a strong economy. And this increased investment will have significant improvements. It will raise state and local tax receipts by $315 million each year, while increasing disposable household income by $150 for each household each year in this 5-year time frame. Next slide. The amount of funding in this bill has caused some confusion. The bill includes funds for a 5-year reauthorization of existing highway programs, plus additional funds. The IIJA includes $550 billion above the baseline across all types of infrastructures. And you see this on the left. We're talking about energy, power, water, sewer. When you look at this $550 billion, the multimodal transportation portion on the right represents about $284 billion above the baseline. So this includes $110 billion for roads and bridges, $39 billion for transit, $66 billion for rail, $25 billion for airports, $17 billion for ports and waterways. Next slide. Highway funding increases 21% to North Carolina DOT. That's roughly $240 million in new and traditional formula funding, plus an additional $114 million for 4 new programs that are supported by the general funds. And those are the bridge monies, the EV charging, additional ferry boat money, and funds for the Appalachian Development Regional Highway System. These funds are desperately needed investments, especially in bridges, where North Carolina, we continue to have over 10% of our rural bridges classified as poor. It also expands the role of state DOTs to lead the nation's infrastructure development of electric charging stations. Public transit funding will increase 32%. These funds will be used to support things like rural public transportation. That would include the purchase of about 30 to 50 transit vehicles each year. The funds will also support increased funding for bike ped infrastructure and for rural ferry programs. Outside of those categories, airports will also receive significant funding. North Carolina airports are expected to receive approximately $460 million over 5 years. There are also significant increased funding opportunities for both passenger and freight rail and for rail safety. Next slide. The largest increases in highway funding will support 4 programs, 2 of which focus on safety. And one of the things to keep in mind in this bill is that many of these existing formula programs have expanded eligibility. So for example, the Highway Safety Improvement Program authorizes about 10% of the funding for education and research, while the National Highway Performance Program funds can now be used to improve resiliency from sea level rise to other extreme weather events. Next slide. So let's talk about what this bill, it doesn't do. It doesn't solve the federal long-term funding crisis for transportation. It doesn't create long-term stability for the industry to gear up staffing for longer than 5 years. largely because first the fund is paid for out of a general fund transfer, and all of those discretionary funds, we don't know if those will recur, but those are general fund revenue sources as well, that simply can't be seen as secure. And it doesn't solve NCDOT's shortfall in the STIP. As you can see, North Carolina's Transportation Improvement Program is over-programmed. The IIJA will offset some project delays, but without a long-term funding solution implemented at both the state and federal levels, the future of transportation funding is uncertain at best. And this is why organizations like the Chamber and its effort with the Destination 2030 movement is so critical to the future of North Carolina. Next slide. NCDOT leadership is committed to a transparent and collaborative approach as we work to better manage the impact of inflation on project scheduling. Leadership has enacted a series of changes to improve this process and to restore trust. Among those changes is the department has paused the prioritization 6.0 process. And so there will be no new projects added into the next mix. But we're also working to refine all of our project costs and find areas where we can reduce project cost. Next slide. These changes include conducting value engineering studies and examining processes to produce a reliable long-range program. The Board of Transportation will review the 2024 to 2033 STIP in 1 year's time at the December 2022 board meeting. Next. I would be remiss if I didn't note that 28% of the IIJA highway infrastructure programs are discretionary. And outside of highways, there are many new programs for transit and rail, airports, broadband. NCDOT will be aggressive in pursuing these grant opportunities, and we are formulating new processes to perfect our grant project selection and application process. Among the items I think are most excited about are the large infra and RAISE grants, the bridge funds, and the rail grant. As was discussed by Representative Price's Chief of Staff, winning a rail grant, for example, will allow NCDOT to expand intercity and passenger rail, such as connecting Richmond and Raleigh via the S-Line. But this also goes further. It enables service to historically underserved communities up that route in Franklin and Vance counties. Next slide. NCDOT leadership has taken immediate steps to reform our grant process. We are hiring a new grants manager position. We are creating a new grants management database system. And we are refining our process to select the most competitive project candidates. Next slide. It's been a pleasure to talk to you today. Feel free to reach out to me anytime, and I welcome any questions you may have.
Thanks, Amna. Just a couple questions. There's a few in the chat box, and I'll go through those in a minute. But just a couple questions that I had. What does NCDOT need from the business community as we think about chasing kind of these non-formula based funding pieces of the IIJA? How can we help?
Well, first, let me say, in terms of IIJA, North Carolina DOT, we want to be industry partners with you. If you feel that your firm knows of a project that meets the characteristics of the grant, and that project is in the STIP, let us know. We want any help possible in putting forth the strongest projects possible. On a state level, again, we had a small win in the budget with the transfer of the small term leases, largely due to the work of the Destination 2030 movement. We really do need the business community to continue to advocate for additional funding.
Thanks. And looking forward, you talked a little bit about 2022, 2023, kind of the STIP and how that lays out. When do you think kind of obviously folks that are paying attention to this, folks in the industry, the business community who are paying attention to roads, infrastructure, water, when do you think we will really see the impact of a lot of these dollars? Is it in a year? Is it in 3 years, 5 years? Kind of in your perspective, when will we see kind of the impact of these dollars here in North Carolina?
As you know, NCDOT has been going through a process of delaying projects. We can tell you that this funding essentially keeps on track our 36-month wet list. So we do not anticipate any further delays. In a longer range, it will enable fewer projects to be postponed. And we will be able to lit some really big projects over the next 22, 23, 24. And these include projects like the Winston-Salem Northern Beltline, the eastern section, the future I-74. We have several improvements now on 95, on 85. That's going to be expanded to 8 lanes. Those are back on schedule. US 70 improvements around Havelock Bypass. So we're identifying all of those projects that have been affected that can go back to the normal schedule.
I hope everybody in the audience was writing those down feverishly, because that's great news. Just to know that despite all of the challenges with funding, despite all the challenges with budgets and inflation and just kind of what we've seen out of prioritization kind of being delayed, to know that those projects, which are incredibly important to our competitiveness, will hopefully be on track over the next 3 to 5 years.
Now also, one of the areas where we're moving the quickest, I think, is identifying bridge money, because we're getting in formula funding 90 million additional dollars a year. We're going to be highly competitive for those discretionary funds. So we've already identified bridges on interstates and on the national highway system that were 10 years out that can be accelerated.
That's great. That's great. This package obviously does a lot more than roads and bridges, water, resiliency, broadband. Does this change, or how does this affect how NCDOT kind of works and approaches some of the non-formula based funding with other state agencies or even federal agencies? What does that look like?
The bill crosses so many agencies. I think a great example are the new charging infrastructure funds. Well, NCDOT will take the lead in developing a state plan, but we'll be partnering with so many state and federal agencies, DEQ, the Energy Office, Department of Administration, university centers. So this is going to be so much more of a collaborative effort than we've seen in the past.
Thank you so much, Amna, for your time this morning. And as you all can see, we kind of started on a very high level and got more granular as the hour went on. A huge thank you to all of you who attended today's webinar. Amna, thank you so much. We look forward to having you hopefully on for another presentation like this in the coming months, as we can just keep our members informed as what does the rollout of this look like, and just keep them informed there. Again, the North Carolina Chamber is driving the conversation of a modernized and sustainable revenue formula for our transportation network. And the folks on this call, the attendees, we really need your support. I'd ask you to take a minute to find the Destination 2030 page on our website. I'm going to drop a link in the chat here in just a second. And sign up, be a part of the coalition. so that your voice can be heard. When you sign up, you'll be invited to regular Destination 2030 Coalition meetings, which we're excited will be starting back in January, and you can stay up to date with the latest information. We really hope that you all in today's webinar found this content valuable. When you exit the webinar, there's a brief survey. We'd appreciate any feedback that you all have from today's webinar to help us improve the sessions. And let me get that link in the chats here so I don't forget it. Again, the recording from today's webinar, which I believe has been answered in the Q&A, will be made available via email within 24 hours of the webinar. Thank you so much for being with us today, and most importantly, be well and be safe. Thank you and goodbye.